Well, it's great to be here. Don, 1,000 thanks. For Paul, I have thanks, but also, you know, I don't know, having drawn me into this piece of work, which turned out to be more complicated than I imagined it was going to be. My fault. So what I'm going to present is, I haven't been able to articulate all these ideas that I had. It's not ideas, but anyway, the material that I had into an elegant piece. So what I'm going to be reading and in part talking through are the blocks of what will be the paper for the issue. So most of the major themes and concepts elaborated by Gramsci in the prison notebooks have been thoroughly discussed, but there are still a few exceptions, and one of them is the term Lorianism, or the theme of Lorianism. And Lorianism is a term that Gramsci coined to define or describe a socio-cultural phenomenon of great political significance, as you will see from what I'm going to say, that is simultaneously a symptom and a cause of the corruption of civil society. He described Lorianism, quote, as the absence of a systematic critical attitude, carelessness in the conduct of scholarly activity, unquote. And then a little later in the same paragraph, and this is a paragraph I will later quote at length because it's crucial. He says, every period has its Lorianism. As it turns out, in the last few years, Gramsci, as a now dead figure, has attracted the attention of several latter-day Lorians who have been spinning remarkable theories. You know, one, I mentioned just two. One theory is that the horrible, demonic Togliatti and Sraffa took two notebooks away from when the notebooks were sent to the Soviet Union. They took away two notebooks. Why? Because they contained Gramsci's refutation of everything he had. And there was a cockamamie theory about labeling and so on and so forth. Anyway, a lot of money was spent x-raying these wretched things, and it turned out, except, and this is real Lorianism, that Lopipa, the scholar, is a professor still, actually even argued what's in these notebooks. You know, it's a philology of a blank text. It's absolutely brilliant. And the other one was that Gramsci recanted, and it was amusing to refute this. The argument was that according to the Penal Code of Italy, if you demand a review of your status and you get a reduction or whatever, that means you have automatically renounced the thing. And this was published in the newspapers, and the Penal Code was quoted, and I was in my office. I got a phone call. I was told about this, which was amazing. I went to our law library, found the Penal Code, and it was exactly as quoted, except for the footnote that this was the Penal Code as it was amended in 1962. Anyway, so that's Lorianism, right? But this is not what I'm going to dwell on. At the same time, a sizable, now this is happening at exactly the same time that Gramscian studies of the serious kind are going through what one could call right now their philological golden age. Yet, it is the new Lorians with their fantasies who occupy center stage in the mass media and occupy, of course, the majority of the cultural pages of putatively serious newspapers and periodicals. These are not appearing in the National Enquirer. This is like Corriere della Sera, La Repubblica, and so on. It is, of course, important to refute such distortions thoroughly and vehemently, but doing so may not by itself address the question of whether and to what extent these new manifestations of Lorianism are indicative of something more broadly worrisome and even ominous about the state of political culture and cultural politics at the present time. In the first note devoted to Aquila Loria, which occurs early in the very first notebook, Gramsci writes, and I'm going to quote just a bit because I said this is part of a later note which I'll quote at length. It says, Loria is not a teratological individual case. And this is the crucial point I'm building this paper. He is the most complete and perfect exemplar of a series of representatives and so on. And the second, I'm skipping. In general terms, Lorianism is characteristic of a certain type of literary and scientific projection, and is connected to the poor organization of culture, and then the phrase that will be the leitmotif, and hence to the absence of restraint and criticism. That's Gramsci. The story of Aquila Loria's fortunes as a prominent intellectual over 4 decades, stretching from the late 19th century through the 1930s, is an instructive example of how a quasi-teratological case turns out to be, in the end, a symptom of a deep problem that, as Gramsci observes in one of his final notes on Lorianism, culminates in a national catastrophe. So what I'm going to do is to trace this is an expository paper, to trace this story is talk about 4 individuals who dealt with Loria. The first one was Engels, the second Antonio Labriola, the third Croce, Benedetto Croce, and the fourth Gramsci. Aquila Loria owed his fame, or depending on the beholder, notoriety, probably in equal measure to his brazen self-promotion and to Engels' harsh attack on him in the preface, as well as the supplement and addendum, I think it was called, to volume 3 of Capital. The first thing that Engels brings up in the preface is Loria's distortion of Marx's biography. This is itself an interesting tale. The year Marx died, 1883, so we're still way before the publication of volumes 2 and 3 of Capital. Loria contributed an article on him to Nuova Antologia, one of the leading literary periodicals in Italy. Later, this essay would be reproduced in a book, which he elaborated the essay. The book is called Marx, it's available in English, and it's all there. It is not only riddled with errors and distortions, as Engels claims, but it is also in certain passages truly bizarre. One has to read the piece as to genuinely appreciate its shocking oddities. I'm only going to quote a few snippets. Here is the opening sentence, or a couple of opening sentences. This is Gloria writing. It is unquestionably one of the strangest anomalies exhibited by the polychrome flora of human thought, that revolutionary blossoms should so frequently spring from aristocratic seeds, and that the most incendiary and rebellious spirits should emerge from a domestic and social environment compounded of conservatism and reaction. That's the opening sentence. In the third paragraph, he provides an illustration of this point, which is not any less peculiar. He quotes, "Such has been the lot of the great rebels of the world, of men like Dante, Voltaire, Byron, Kropotkin, and Tolstoy, who all spring from the gentle class and whose birthright placed them among the owners of property. Similar was the lot of Karl Marx." Then come the gross distortions. He goes on about difficult to imagine a more typically refined and aristocratic entourage than the one wherein the future high priest of revolution, this is Loria's language, was born and passed his early days. He was born, etc., and then he married into another family, and of course, I don't know where this distortion came from. As he grew up, the young man was an intimate in the best houses of the district, and one of his closest friends was Edgar von Westphalen, who would become his brother-in-law, who subsequently became a member of the reactionary Manteuffel ministry. Edgar von Weizmann became a communist and was a very active member of the Belgian communist group. And then he goes on and on and on. Is it then, this is to complete this paragraph, is it then not truly remarkable that from such an environment, eminently calculated to foster ideas of obscurantism and reaction, there should emerge the most brilliant, most consistent, and most invincible example of a thinker and revolutionary agitator? Now, just think of it. Marx born to and reared in a reactionary, in a aristocratic entourage. He also uses a very, not so subtle actually, anti-Semitic stereotype. He says his family, his ancestors, came from an extremely ancient stock devoted to the accumulation of wealth. Jews, right? Anyway, then I told you about his brother-in-law. It goes on. Loria's description of Marx's admittedly difficult living conditions in London, the next part of the biography, seems to have been drawn from some kind of Dickensian portrayal of the most destitute of citizens of inhabitants of the British metropolis. No less baffling are Loria's oscillations from effusive praise of Marx to his shortcomings. In addition, Loria's contradiction is somewhat attenuated by his suggestion that circumstances prevented Marx from completing his work, and that the posthumous publications were tainted by dubious editorial decisions, of course, Engels, right? Thus, for example, he points out that Marx's theory of surplus value, which in his view is disabled by, quote, sophisms and arbitrary assumptions, unquote. Anyway, genius and then sophisms, but these are to be found, he says, these sophisms in the posthumous work. In other words, the text edited by Engels. He also provides descriptions of Marx's views published before his death that were both simplistic and distorting. Engels was entirely justified in pointing out that Loria reduces Marx's views, quote, to a quite Philistine level. If there were time, it would be worth dwelling on the following passage in, there's a long quotation here in which I'm not going to read it all, but basically you could see his rhetorical style, which doesn't address substance, but there's these sweeping, silly things. He says, it is true that Engels, faithful executor of his divinity's wishes, devoted himself with splendid zeal to the publication of the manuscript. But alas, what delusion was in store for the admirers of the master? What a Russian campaign of disaster organized by enthusiastic lieutenants to the hurt of this Napoleon of thought. That's his style. By the way, but the interesting part of this quotation is that he also argues that, in this sort of biography, which by the way has no footnotes, no allusions, that between the first preliminary work on the critique of political economy and then the first volume of Capital, that Marx moved away from philosophy, and from Hegel, and this for Loria was wonderful, right? That's what made him. However, all of this could not but have rankled Engels, but there is something even more nefarious. In the first edition of Loria's book, which is called La teoria economica della Costituzione politica, loosely the economic theory of the state, I could say. 1886 he published this. In the first edition, this is amazing, Loria claimed to be the original theorist of historical materialism. Here's Engels' scathing comment. This is from the preface to Capital Volume 3. The discovery that political conditions and events have their explanation in corresponding economic conditions has now been shown to have been made not by Marx in 1845, but by Mr. Loria in 1886. He can now run around Italy, posing as the author of a new and epoch-making theory of history, until the Italian socialists find time to strip the illustrious Loria of his stolen peacock feathers. There are also other technical issues that Loria raised and Engels refuted, but one does not need to get into the complexities of Marxist economic theory here. Still, it is noteworthy that, so Engels published this critique, right? Meanwhile, Loria is going to publish another edition of his work, in which the claim, it was published in French first and then in Italian, his claim that he invented historical, or came up with, disappears. But instead what he does is he's got several pages, 8-9 pages, in which he traces the genealogy of what he says is historical materialism, starting with Harrington in the 17th century, all the way down. And so Marx becomes one name in a whole long string, right? Which ends with, after he talks about all these people together, then there's Jones, and then there's Jones, Proudhon, Marx, quote, parentheses, who throws much light on the question, close parentheses, Engels, Lassalle, de Molinari, and de Graeff. In the entire volume of this edition, Marx is cited 3 times, and the entire book is devoted to the economic basis of morality, the economic basis of the state, and the economic basis of social structure. I mean, anyway, Engels' polemic with Loria was motivated, it is fair to suppose, by the urge to protect Marx's legacy, while at the same time refuting any suggestion that he was any less than rigorously faithful to his intellectual partner. There was also much more at stake, namely, for Engels, right, the fate of Marx's inspired socialist and communist movements. The dominant tactic, in any case, is adopted by Engels, is to discredit Loria by any means possible, including some barbs that today would be readily labeled as ethnic slurs. For example, Engels writes, had Loria been a timid German, he might have experienced a certain degree of embarrassment, but he is a cocky southerner and comes from a hot climate, whereas he can testify brazenness is a natural condition. This was Engels. On the other hand, Loria could hardly object to this sideswipe, since he himself had propounded theories linking geography to character and natural propensities. And so, for example, he said the people living in mountains are of higher moral stature than people who live in the plains. And of course, in Italy, that means the most corrupt people were people in Venice, right, sea level. And he argued this. Anyway, Engels' polemic with Loria is also about something more substantive, right? The seeming incompatibility between the theory of surplus value and the theory of constant profit. But the point is that what was really at stake from Engels' point of view was the tarnishing and the distortion of a theory that at this point is turning into the basis of the foundation of the political parties, and not just in all over Europe. And this is where now comes La Briola. So little has been written, because probably Italian stuff doesn't attract as much attention, how to describe the correspondence between La Briola and Engels. So when Engels started to be uncomfortable with the Loria stuff, he published a letter in a Zurich paper, saying Gloria was wrong. This was 1883, so almost immediately after Loria published the short biography of Marx. At that point, La Briola starts corresponding with Engels, and kept him informed about what he called the Italian case of Loria. And he would send him cuttings or transcribe certain things for him, and so on and so forth. At the same time that he was doing this, it's corresponding with Engels, Labriola is also using his leverage, if you want to call it that, with Benedetto Croce. So Labriola was sort of the teacher of Croce. And Croce starts receiving this pressure from Labriola, who's saying, you have to write a critique of Loria, and Labriola even more or less arranges, for him to publish it, to compose it and publish it in a French journal first, Devenir Social, and then from there it was published also in Italy. So the question is, why was Labriola so insistent and persistent in this? Well, if you think about it, so we're talking about this essay by Croce. He finished and published it in 1896. In 1892 was the year of the birth, if one could call it that, of the Italian Socialist Party. Now, the Italian Socialist Party has a very strange history compared to other socialist parties in Europe, in that it came into existence not through some refinement of a theoretical or ideological position, but because of a schism with the anarchists. So at first, the anarchists and others constituted the left. Then there's a break. And there is really no clear idea. There's nothing like a party program for the socialists. This is Turati who's the leader. And Labriola was very worried. Labriola was a great supporter of the workers' movement, and at the same time saying there's something hollow, there's something missing, right? And the distortions of Loria were not only a threat to the possibility of formulating, because the socialists saw Loria as their ally, right, and even regarded him as a socialist. So Labriola feared this was not only a threat to, or a debilitating voice when it came to formulating a coherent party program, but also, and therefore hurt the movement, but also, of course, Labriola at this point is starting to work on his Marxist theory stuff, on the philosophy of historical materialism. And as you well know, he is formulating a brilliant theoretical exposition of historical materialism, as the phrase he used, philosophy of praxis. This is a phrase that has been erroneously attributed to Gramsci as a kind of code word for Marxism. No, the philosophy of praxis is a phrase that is at the very core of Labriola's elaboration of Marxist theory. And the crux of this whole formulation, the reason Labriola goes through all that trouble, is because he wants to demonstrate that there is a way to look at Marxist concept of history and of historical materialism as not dependent on, or not as a variant of, positivism, and not dependent on or a variant of idealism, Hegel, right? And it's too elaborate here, but this is crucial for him, and if the socialist movement starts drifting in Loria's way, you're going to have pure determinism, or what Gramsci would later call pure economism. So this is why it's so urgent for Labriola. And 1895, right, was the 50th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto, and Labriola is writing this famous essay, which becomes the first chapter of his volume of essays, supposedly, right, this anniversary was deemed to be a good occasion to further the labor cause. And of course, this problem with Loria and the way he was functioning as a magnet to the left, to the socialists, was very worrisome. Anyway, so he persuades Croce, and Croce is not, of course, as you well know, a great fan of socialism. But although this early in the game, Croce has not yet emerged as an anti-Marxist or anti-communist. He will become so a bit later. But at this stage, as you know, he is carrying on one very important, if not crucial, element of Labriola's thinking, which is the campaign against determinism, against positivist philosophy in Europe. Right? Also, as you know, this is the early period in which Croce's popular voice, I mean the voice popular one that reaches at least the newspapers, right, as opposed to the rigorously philosophical work, that is the Croce that is calling for what he calls the moral and intellectual reform that in his view Italy needed to undergo in order to bring about some kind of socio-political stability. Because, I mean, not only was it unstable, but of course the bourgeoisie in Italy was very poor in creating and even worse in disseminating a popular and what culture that Gramsci would call, you know, a national popular culture. So there were points of overlap, right, with Labriola. So even though it might be strange that Croce would write against Loria and defend sort of Marxism, it wasn't quite that. Okay. So Labriola's philosophical goal was, as I just mentioned, to demonstrate Marxism is an autonomous and self-sufficient philosophy, hence the philosophy of praxis. And of course, this is not to be underestimated, the effort to launch the Socialist Party in Italy on solid theoretical foundations with a coherent program, which he didn't succeed in doing. I'm running out of time, so let me jump to the other blocks I'm putting in here. So then comes Croce. As I mentioned, you know, he's of course only too happy to attack the positivism of Loria, but he does something else. First of all, it's a very good essay. He goes through various problems of Loria, starting with his style, his logic, his positivism, his lack of understanding of what Marx thought about the linkage between the development and the modes of production and social political transformation. And finally, he concludes by highlighting the most awful contradictions that vitiate Loria's Loria's essay. So those are the motivations. So you see this another piece. Now I'm going to jump quickly so I can read this note to Gramsci. So here is the problem as Gramsci saw it. So Gramsci does not have yet, before he starts the notebooks, any idea that he's going to deal with Croce. We know from his correspondence. And on the first page of the notebooks, after he obtained permission to start writing in his prison cell, he makes a list of topics, and Loria is not one of them. And yet, Loria appears very early in Notebook 1. And not Loria, but Loria and Lorianism. And interestingly, it appears around the same time that there's another category that Gramsci invents called Brescianism. This is named after a Jesuit named Father Bresciani, who was an extreme conservative, and he comes to be used by Gramsci as the name, like Lorianism, Brescianism, or of those who are conservatives from a Catholic or religious or pious position. So not the social sciences, but literature and the other arts. And from the very first note, Gramsci says, okay, let's take a look at some of the things that Loria wrote. And he describes very briefly 3 or 4 of his crazy articles. I mean, I think you won't believe when I tell you they're really crazy, right? Like one of them says, this is Gloria, the new invention, aviation, will destroy all the restraints which until now have obstructed mankind, and thus it will allow mankind to be completely and truly free for the first time. Then he explains aviation is going to remedy all the social problems, including putting people with whom Lombroso would describe as, patsy and crazy and abnormal on airplanes. They'll be flying at 20,000 feet and get them to be therapy, altitude therapy. Anyway, so he lists those things. Then he says, it's not a question about Loria, right? It's that phrase I read you, Loria is not a teratological case. He is rather the most complete and perfect exemplar of a series of representatives and so on. And then he goes on to say, every period has, it should be pointed out that every period has its more or less accomplished and perfected Lorianism, and each century has its own. Now I'm going to quote 2 whole paragraphs, but this is basically like telling you what I'm going to be commenting on and why it is, in a way, if one can extrapolate from it, terrifying. Okay, every period has its own more or less accomplished and perfected Lorianism, and each century has its own. Hitlerism has shown that in Germany, underneath the apparent domain of a serious intellectual group, there smoldered a monstrous Lorianism which has cracked the official crust and has become widespread as the scientific concept and method of a new, in quotes, officialism. That Loria could exist, lucubrate, publish books and tomes at his own expense, is not in itself all that strange. There are always discoverers of perpetual motion and parish priests who publish sequels of Jerusalem Liberata. But, this is the point, right? The fact that he became a pillar of culture, a master. Now, he was professor in Turin, right, where Gramsci was a student. And that he spontaneously found an enormous audience. This is what one must reflect on. And as a sign of the weakness, this terrifying language, the weakness of the bulwarks of criticism, which existed even during periods of normality. One should consider how easy it is during abnormal times of uncontrolled passion for individuals like Loria, supported by interested powers, to overwhelm every bulwark and transform an environment of intellectual culture which is still weak and frail into a swamp for decades to come. Only today, and this is Gramsci writing, in parentheses he writes, 1935. Only today, 1935, after the displays of brutality and unprecedented infamy of German, in quotes, culture, dominated by Hitlerism, some intellectuals have become aware of the fragility, this is sarcastic, only today, right, of the fragility of Western civilization, in all its necessary contradictory expressions, which grew out of the early Renaissance after the year 1000 and gained dominance in the French Revolution and the movement of ideas known as classical German philosophy and as English classical economies. Hence, the impassioned criticism of intellectuals like George Sorel, like Spengler, and so on, who fill cultural life with suffocating and sterilizing gases. So he writes that, and the notebook has a lot of little notes to remind him he's going to use these notes for later work, or so he thought, of other figures, right? And like Lombroso and Ferri and Orano, who were. But then there's something which I'm not going to use as the conclusion, but I have to put it in my paper because it's a terrible way to end something. Gramsci says, then in another note, says, what is the purpose of doing this critique? He says, on the one hand, you have to be fair, and he says, I am being fair. But what can you change? How does one react? Then he says the best solution would be education. But it is a solution that we've been waiting for a long time and would take a long time. Especially when it comes to the huge agglomeration of people that are easily transported by the mania for opium. By this point, he means the opium of popular culture and other problems. It is therefore important to appreciate how difficult it is to overcome fantasy and so on and so forth. And he goes on like this, like, what can one do? And he says, well, perhaps you've got to find a way to create, for intellectuals to create, in the culture, and this is what he calls, I'm quoting him directly, an aversion for intellectual abuse or poor intellectual work. We have to create sober humans who are patient, who do not despair when confronted with the most horrible errors, and do not get excited with every piece of folly that comes along, pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will, which is no solution really, right? However, and this I think, we'll see what you think, but I think from there I could then go on to demonstrate that this is only a partial treatment of Lorianism, because you see the name. But when Gramsci is writing other notes, particularly, of course, the notes on intellectuals, but particularly his notes on philosophy, where he distinguishes between positivism, idealism, and the philosophy of praxis. And the large body of notes that, like these, have been ignored. None of this has been translated yet in the various Gramsci anthologies, which is the notes on journalism that have been ignored, because the notes on journalism are about the state of the culture, which is part of the larger picture within which this fits. And finally, there is also a connection with the notebook, or the notes and the notebook, on subalternity, because one of the earliest, the first note that Gramsci transports from his earlier work to the special notebook devoted to subordinates has this brief but powerful observation. He says, people like Lazzaretti, these phenomena of rebels, primitive rebels, as Hobsbawm would call them, are explained away by people like Lombroso, by the positivists, who say it has something to do with their cranium size or whatever. So again, Lorianism, which hides, conceals behind scientificity, not conceals, but actually blocks behind scientificity the socio-political analysis of movements such as the peasant rebellion in Arcidosso with Lazzaretti. Okay, I'll stop there.
I think we're left with the deadness of that final comment of Gramsci's. The pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will passage has been translated before. It's not that.
No, he uses that phrase 3 or 4 times. This is the last time it appears in the notebooks. The very last
this
time.
you have not gotten, as it were, to this section yet.
Right.
Right, in the translation.
This is notebook 28. There's only one notebook after this, which is the one on grammar.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, it seemed to me as I was listening to this that it was kind of an allegory of our current situation, and that maybe you were calling out for more criticism.
Yes, yes, you're absolutely right.
An effort to be more rigorous in what we see around us in the current regime.
Or how to analyze it too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I don't want, it'd be too difficult to do. So I want to say, look, I mean, Engels was right, no, you correct a person like Gloria, and then Alabriola was also seeing the importance of opposing him but with Gramsci it becomes a big problem. I mean, and so I thought if I just tell that story, it should be, without talking about us today, right, it should be clear that we have a big problem, not a question of just addressing the people who say stupid things. It's a larger. By the way, when I translated the word bulwarks, I forgot what the Italian original, but I didn't think it would be clear to use the Italian to translate literally. What he meant are the dikes, like in Holland, right? But I said bulwarks, but he means like a little hole, and before you know it, you have a flood.
So what are the conditions that are necessary to be able to put in place the possible respect for the activity of intellect, which is lacking?
Well, this is not a happy thing to record. But many years ago, we were at Pittsburgh, not the Boundary 2, but Boundary 2 people were there too, and I had started writing something on Gramsci's treatment of the intellectuals, the main point of which was that the term organic intellectual is used very badly. But in it I made a big deal about Gramsci's insistence on whatever aspect of intellectuals he was writing on rigor. Right? So he's obsessed, right? And somebody in the audience objected, says, oh, rigor, this kind of stuff. Why can't we be free to explore? So maybe even in academia we have a problem, I don't know.
To regress from the rigor of everything.
Yeah.
But it's considered elitist or something, I don't know.
Well, all right, so I'll play devil's advocate for a second. I mean, I guess the question is whether we think of ourselves as working within something like a philosophy of praxis, which is to say changing the world and not just interpreting the world, if you like. Because one of the temptations is a sort of monastic one.
Sure.
To say out there, the ones who are being practical are fucking it up. Let us at least stick to the purity, the rigor, the beauty, I don't know, the higher standards of thinking, and wait for the dark ages to recede, at which point perhaps, someone will remember that our little texts are off on this thumb drive, or whatever. Or, you think that you only replace one narrative with another narrative, that rigor or the high standards of scholarship, they'll make us feel good, but
Sure.
not likely to
Sure.
intervene in the world in a strong way.
Sure.
And that, I say this as,
Sure.
I think I was born to vulgarize, and therefore, some of the temptation to vulgarize just seems irresistible to me. Some part of you must want to tell a story.
I agree with vulgarization. That's not what Gramsci is against. And in fact, he uses divulgazione. So there's for him, vulgar could mean Loria, reducing Marxism to basically a let's say shallow determinism. That's vulgarization. Divulgation. That's why he established ordinary war. This is fascinating, right? So the Italian Communist Party came into existence out of a fight which had three sides to it. One was the left in general. Then within the left, the communists, there were two camps. And one camp was called the Turin Group. The Turin Group was Gramsci, Togliatti, will come to me anyway. And the other communists were Buttigieg, a bit of a determinist. When they split in the Lyon thing, the fear was, and it should not have been a fear, but that the Turin Group would dominate. What was wrong in the views of people with the Turin Group? The Turin Group, long before the schism, so going back to the middle teens, 1912, 14, was arguing very, very, very strongly that you cannot separate culture from politics. And this was considered dangerous because the workers' movement had to be first and foremost militant and looking at the factory and so on and so forth. And at one point, a syndicalist wrote this scathing essay, obviously aimed at the Turin Group and particularly Gramsci, saying workers don't learn from these sophisticated things. Our learning is in the the calluses of our hand, right? And this produced an essay from the young Gramsci called Socialism and Culture, which is a crucial text. So, you know, for him, learning was not like, so I don't, you know, tell you the truth, because I think even the people like Croce, right, they stood above it all. That posture doesn't work. If you really are, I don't want to, let's say, critically, totally honest, right? You are risking your position, right? And this is one thing that Croce, ironically, given that he always stood above everything, argues about Loria. He says, he stands above it all. So he's anti-bourgeois, but the bourgeoisie gives him all these awards. He was made a member of the Academy of the Lince, and it's like, you know, being elected to the highest academic institution, formation in Italy. So are we risking much? I don't know. So it's not between Olympian. Anyway, so when we translated all of it.
So his critique really wasn't about Loria at all. It was about.
In the end, it wasn't. I mean, he uses him.
It was about the culture that had transposed Lorian into a common sense.
That's right.
And
into common sense, exactly.
But that's a different critique. I mean, that means that he isn't addressing the mode of scholarship necessarily. He's addressing the conditions of reception.
That make him accept,
And that would require a generalized critique of the entire cultural apparatus.
Right. So that's why I was talking about that huge body of notes on journalism, for example, is one part of that critique.
So Loria is really a symptom of a much more pervasive dis-ease that Gramsci is diagnosing. But as soon as Croce and Labriola and the others become involved, aren't they playing in the game that has turned Lorianism into as soon as you turn that figure into a figure that requires that kind of examination by intellectuals.
By giving him prominence, right?
Well, that would make him part of the academy. If he is addressed by figures of the standing of Croce and Labriola, and now Gramsci.
In fact, Gramsci has another objection apropos of that. Louis J. Einaudi, who became later, great economist, became later first president of the Republic of Italy after the war, published a bibliography to talk about legitimizing in 1932, I believe, he published a bibliography of Loria's work.
there's a certain enjoyment that I hear in they're doing. I mean, it's related to Schadenfreude. There's a pleasure in this kind of horror that is comparably frightening. Anyway.
Think of Hannity and the engagements with Hannity.
Yep.
This can be the last question.
Actually, it's really in the wake of Dante. Of course, I remember we were doing Gramsci together.
We did
Precisely
some.
Gramsci's meditation, exactly, on the prospects of intellectual investment. And I remember this wonderful line that the intellectual has to be maneuvered. Right? It's not monastery or not, it's the engagement. Who's Gramsci now?
Well, it depends who will.
Well, forgive me, I'm thinking of Cornell, because part of the issue is to do the critique and to insist upon the critique. And at risk, and you know, sometimes Cornell says crazy things, but he consistently trying to put forward the malaise of Lorianism in our moment. And in different venues. I mean, he doesn't have, ordinary
Sure.
But it would seem that what I take from your work always, which is what's for me commendable about the project of translation, right, is presenting the project and exposing it to more and more people, not just students, right, can incite the sort of critical thinking, which is part of Gramsci's point. And I'm wondering, isn't that part of what we need to be doing?
I hope
So
so.
it's not a frivolous question when I ask you, who's Gramsci now? And not just in this country.
Yeah, I don't know
Who's
the
Gramsci
answer
now?
to that. I mean, I see obviously some critiques that are simultaneously attacking an intellectually weak position and the institutions that enable it, right? But I don't know to what extent it's even possible today.
A recent book came out about 2 years ago. I'm supposed to review it. Because we're talking about Lorianism, Gramsci and Tahrir.
I saw it. Yeah, I read it, sir. Yeah.
And?
I actually like it. It's a bit simplistic, but it's... Well, I remember, for example, you've all read this because it appears recurrently. In some articles, for example, on a technical issue by Krugman on the economist of the Heritage Foundation arguing that lowering taxes would actually increasing or or whatever, right? And he would also say, this is a person who's got an institutional affiliation, he's consulted, and it makes no difference, does it? I mean, you show somebody has said something absolutely ridiculous, and the institution still pays him. I don't know whether it's possible. I mean, obviously, in Gramsci's time, it was not possible to shame Gloria, right? He retained his fame. So.
But apropos John's remark, it's not about shaming Gloria.
No, but I mean, how those people thrive, no? And the institutions. So it's corrupting the university too, right? When Gramsci goes to the University of Turin, and there's Gloria teaching. And Einaudi, by the way, too, in the economics department.
Trying to start an Islamic certificate.
Pardon?
We're trying to start a group of us.
Okay.
Together. Again, this is the issue of who's Gramsci, right? Where let's try and do something. Right? With a very larcenous attitude. Let's get what we can from the institution. But in the course of discussing what we're trying to do, just the practical of setting up the certificate, it actually uttered, these are all great intellectual initiatives, but we need to sell it to the administration whose concerns are money and dollars. Interesting kind of schism. Right? So it's a serious question because every time I read you or listen to you, it's clearly a call to action. No?
But that's why I also introduced the pessimistic parts.
Well, that part, it's the call to action.
If I could just pick up one point from that, though, I mean, to go back also to what Bruce was saying provocatively, there has to be, possibly, there should be, there is, however you want to say this, in light of the university doing what you're trying to make it do, and so there has to be a kind of division of labor in the practical business of changing the world. So the specific case that always comes to my mind when I try to think about this issue is, how do I think about Curtius, Hans Robert Curtius, right? Who stays in Germany, keeps himself securely hidden away, labors at his work, and at the end of the war we discover he's produced one of the great volumes of 20th century humanistic philological research. One reason I dislike the easy adaptation of the Benjaminian metaphor ruinations, there are many things which are not ruins, that I would say is one of them. Now, how to measure the effect upon archive of the existence of such work. Here I come back to what Jonathan and I were talking about earlier, which you know, Jonathan's emphasis on work as a verb. It does seem to me there should be reserved in what is the temptation to the easy critique of the ivory tower. If the figure in the tower is doing that which otherwise could not be done, but which shouldn't also be forgotten. So that does, in some way, not necessarily bring the word rigor back, but it brings something about memory, come back to the word experience, right? It's preservative, after all, there are techniques of knowledge production that we shouldn't forget, no matter what world we might imagine ourselves wanting to produce.
No, it's really there are too. We have examples, right? I mean, so you have Said writing Orientalism and culture and imperialism and covering Islam, right? Well, I mean, we have examples of this. It's just, you've got to figure out, you know.
But let's admit Curtius could not be Edward Said. Okay, but that doesn't mean
Yeah, but I'm saying
it's
it's not like-
something of quite a remarkable measure. And
That is under the circumstances of the
Yeah.
Nazi regime.
Yes. Yes. Well, I'm not even certain from reading that book that he had, to use the term that's been put in play, that he had the vulgar side to his prose.
Well, his earlier literary journalism in response to Western modernism was, it wasn't vulgar, but it was certainly not nearly as highly academic as
That's the
that
later
work.
book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I take that as a correction. That's right. I mean, it's high journalism is what I might refer to it as, right? Very high level journalism, and therefore not quite popular, but vulgar in the sense of vulgate, right?
Yeah,
So-
making Eliot known when
Yes.
he was an explosive
Right.
force. In
No, I
politics.
take that serious. That's correct. That's an important correction. But I did say from the book I wouldn't.
Yeah.
So, are we done?
Now, everybody in this room is invited to the dinner, which will be in the inn at a little after 6:30. It'll be downstairs, I think it's the Birch Room, but it'll be on the board. It'll say American Studies, because that's how I pay for it.
It is the Birch Room.
Yeah, I think so. Whatever room it is, they'll announce
It
it.
is the
But let's
Birch
thank Joe
Room.
for this.